Welcome back to the channel. In the gray, damp undergrowth near Chicago's Wolf Lake in May 1924, a pair of expensive tortoiseshell glasses lay abandoned in the mud. It was a singular, fatal oversight. A tiny, almost invisible crack in what was meticulously designed to be a 7-month masterpiece of murder. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb weren't desperate men driven by poverty or rage. They were wealthy, elite supermen with a combined IQ that shattered every academic record of their time. They had the entire world at their fingertips and a future of limitless potential. Yet they chose the cold embrace of the abyss. Why does a mind capable of mastering the universe decide that the only thrill left in existence is to snuff out the life of an innocent child? Today, we will re-examine the case files together. To understand the blood-soaked events of that May afternoon, we must first look into the minds that conceived them. And there is no better place to start than with the man who believed he was already living in the future, Nathan Leopold. In the 1920s, Chicago was a city of muscle and grit, but Nathan was a creature of pure, unadulterated intellect. He was not merely a bright student. He was a biological anomaly. Imagine a child who reportedly uttered his first coherent words at just 4 months old. While other toddlers were struggling with basic motor skills, Nathan was consuming the world through a lens of advanced logic. By his teens, he had mastered 5 languages and was actively researching 10 more. He didn't just study ornithology, the scientific study of birds. He became one of the nation's leading experts on the Kirtland's warbler, a bird as rare and elusive as Nathan himself felt in a world of common people. He graduated from the University of Chicago at 18, a Phi Beta Kappa member with a mind functioning like a high-speed calculating machine. But a darkness grew in the shadow of that light. Nathan didn't just feel smart. He felt fundamentally different. He looked at the bustling crowds on the Chicago streets not as fellow citizens, but as specimens, intellectually as distant as a human is from a housefly. Physically, Nathan was anything but the image of a titan. He was small, somewhat frail, with prominent, heavy-lidded eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning for data points. This physical unassuming,ness only served to fuel his internal fire. He retreated into the complex, often misinterpreted philosophies of Friedrich Nietzsche, specifically the concept of the Übermensch, the Superman. To Nathan, this wasn't just a philosophical thought experiment. It was a mirror. He truly believed that a human being of sufficient intellectual stature was no longer bound by the petty, herd-like morality of the masses. If you are a god among insects, do the laws of the insects apply to you? His journals from this period reveal a young man drifting further and further from the shores of human empathy. He observed life from a great cold height, calculating the trajectories of others while remaining untouched by their emotions. Yet, for all his perceived godhood, there was a profound, aching void. His brilliance had made him an island. He was a master of the universe who couldn't connect with a single soul in it. He was a Ferrari engine trapped in a bicycle frame, waiting for a catalyst, a reason to finally floor the accelerator. That catalyst walked into his life in the form of Richard Loeb. If Nathan was the cold machinery of this partnership, then Richard was its polished and utterly deceptive exterior. To the high society of Chicago's Kenwood district, Richard Loeb was the golden boy. He was handsome, charming, and possessed a disarming smile that seemed to radiate a genuine warmth. While Nathan was the awkward outcast, Richard was the sun around which the social world revolved. Richard was a prodigy in his own right, becoming the youngest graduate in the history of the University of Michigan at 17. But behind that Ivy League veneer, there was a rotting hollowness. Richard was driven by a chronic, bone-deep boredom. The life of a wealthy heir was too predictable, too safe. He lacked Nathan's intellectual depth, but he possessed something far more dangerous, an insatiable hunger for a thrill. While Nathan documented birds, Richard immersed himself in the seedy underbelly of pulp detective magazines. He didn't read them for justice. He read them to study the mistakes of the villains. He became obsessed with the idea of the master criminal, the figure who could orchestrate chaos and remain untouched in the shadows. To Richard, life was a game of chess where he was the only real player, and everyone else, including his own family, were merely pawns to be manipulated for his amusement. This was the Golden Boy's true face, a petty thief in a tuxedo, a man who possessed everything but valued nothing. When these two orbits finally collided at the University of Chicago, the result was a catastrophic chemical reaction. They were two halves of a lethal whole. Nathan Leopold was instantly and pathologically smitten with Richard Loeb. In Richard, Nathan saw a Superman who didn't just exist in books, but walked and breathed. Richard, however, recognized in Nathan a mind that could handle the intricate details he found tedious. He saw a tool, a brilliant, devoted instrument that he could calibrate to perform the most vicious of tasks. This was the birth of their distorted Übermensch pact. They convinced themselves that their combined IQs placed them in a different evolutionary category. They weren't just students. They were supermen who had moved beyond good and evil. This wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was a cold, intellectualized rejection of the human contract. Nathan provided the logic and obsessive attention to detail, while Richard provided the audacity and the dark, creative spark. They formed a symbiotic bond where Nathan's need for affection was traded for Richard's need for a partner in crime. It was a deal with the devil, signed in the blood of their shared arrogance. They began to view the world as their laboratory and the people in it as nothing more than experimental subjects. The path to the drainage culvert near Wolf Lake was paved with practice runs. For months leading up to May 1924, Leopold and Loeb engaged in a frantic escalation of criminal behavior. They started with what they considered minor transgressions, breaking into fraternity houses to steal cameras, watches, and typewriters. They weren't interested in the value of the items. They were interested in the vicious thrill of the intrusion. When the thrill of simple theft began to wane, they turned to arson. There is something profoundly revealing about a person who enjoys watching things burn. They would set small fires in deserted buildings, feeling a godlike power over the elements. Each time they returned home, uncaught, their belief in their own invincibility grew. They were testing the machinery of the Chicago police and finding it lacking. The insatiable desire for a greater thrill began to consume them. They started planning the perfect crime with the same academic rigor Nathan used for his ornithology papers. They debated every variable, every potential forensic trace, and every psychological loophole. They weren't planning a murder. They were designing a masterpiece of logistics. They stole a typewriter from a former fraternity house, specifically to avoid any handwriting analysis on the ransom notes they planned to send. They practiced driving the routes, timed the sequences, and refined their alibis. These drafts of crime were essential to their evolution. They weren't just criminals, they were students of the dark. By the time they settled on the idea of kidnapping and murder, they had already shed any remaining remnants of their humanity. They were a synchronized engine of destruction, ready to prove to the world that they truly were above the law. To create a masterpiece, one requires a draft. For Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, that draft lasted exactly 7 months, 210 days of cold procedural preparation. They weren't just planning a murder, they were engineering an equation where the solution was meant to be their absolute immunity. In the spring of 1924, a man calling himself Morton D. Ballard began appearing in car rental agencies across Chicago. They eventually settled on a Willie's Night, a sturdy, unremarkable vehicle. But the car was only the shell. The true weapon of this perfect crime was to be a typewriter. Leopold and Loeb knew that in the world of 1920s, forensics, handwriting was a death sentence. So they did something remarkably calculated. They broke into a former fraternity house and stole a portable typewriter. Why this specific one? Because it had no legal connection to either of them. It was a forensic orphan. They took it back to their secret planning room and began to compose the ransom note, word by painstaking word. They weren't just writing a letter, they were testing the limits of the law's ability to track them. Every detail was rehearsed. They timed the drives. They calculated the exact amount of time it would take for a family to receive a letter and for a boy to disappear. This wasn't the work of impulsive teenagers. This was the procedural dismantling of a human life before it had even been taken. They were architects of the void. But every blueprint requires a subject. And on May 21st, 1924, that subject became 14-year-old Bobby Franks. The dramatic irony of his selection is almost too cruel to believe. Bobby wasn't a stranger. He was Richard Loeb's neighbor. He was a distant cousin. He was chosen not because he was hated, but because he was convenient. A wealthy child from a wealthy family. The perfect variable for a ransom plot. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Bobby was walking home from a baseball game. As he neared his home, the Willie's Night pulled alongside him. The window rolled down, and there was a familiar face. Richard, the handsome, charming neighbor. Richard called out to him, offering a lift. He used the lure. He mentioned a tennis racket. He knew Bobby was an avid player. In that moment, the trap snapped shut. Bobby Franks stepped into that car not out of fear, but out of trust. He believed he was entering a conversation about sports. He had no way of knowing that the person smiling at him from the passenger seat was currently a master criminal in his own mind, and the driver was a cold-blooded Superman who viewed him as a biological specimen. The irony is agonizing. He was betrayed by the familiar. The next 60 minutes inside that rented car were a descent into pure, unadulterated nightmare. As Leopold drove toward the industrial wastelands, Richard Loeb moved with an industrial efficiency that was utterly devoid of human emotion. He didn't hesitate. He took a heavy chisel, wrapped in friction tape, and struck Bobby Franks in the back of the head. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace, but the silence of the abyss. Bobby didn't die instantly. He groaned, a sound that should have shattered the resolve of any human being. Instead, it was met with clinical detachment. A gag was forced into the boy's mouth. His body was pushed onto the floorboard. They covered him with a rug. As they drove, they didn't speak of regret. They simply monitored the data. Nathan Leopold kept his eyes on the road. Richard Loeb sat next to the dying child, checking his watch. It was an hour of absolute, bone-chilling indifference. They had crossed the line from thought to action, and they found that the act of murder was, to them, remarkably simple. But the true gruesome peak of their depravity was yet to come. After the act was done, they didn't flee. They were hungry. In one of the most disturbing details in history, Leopold and Loeb stopped at a roadside stand to eat hot dogs and drink root beer. They sat in that car, talking and laughing, all while the body of Bobby Franks lay inches from their feet. When they finally reached the desolate marshes of Wolf Lake, the procedural disposal began. They stripped the boy of his clothes. They poured hydrochloric acid over his face and body to hide the marks of the herd. They pushed the body into a narrow drainage culvert. They stood there in the dark, believing they had achieved the impossible. They had committed the perfect crime. They had killed for no reason other than to prove they could. They drove back to the city, dumped the stolen typewriter into a lagoon, and went to bed, convinced that when the sun rose, they would be the only gods left in Chicago. They were architects of the perfect crime, unaware that they had left behind a single tiny piece of glass that would bring their entire ivory tower crashing down into the mud. As the morning of May 22nd dawned, the first domino began to wobble. A common laborer discovered the mangled remains of Bobby Franks. The perfect crime had already failed its first test, concealment. And yet, the discovery of the body was merely the stage. The true unraveling began with a tiny glinting object resting in the mud. It was a pair of expensive horn-rimmed glasses. In the meticulous planning of 7 months, Nathan Leopold had forgotten the most basic physical reality of his own body. He was nearsighted. During the struggle, the glasses had slipped from his pocket. These weren't ordinary glasses. They featured a unique, patented hinge. Forensic analysis revealed that only 3 people in the entire city of Chicago had purchased this specific frame. One was an elderly lady. One was traveling in Europe. The third was a brilliant law student named Nathan Leopold. The master criminal had left his signature at the scene. It was the classic flaw in the plan, a singular physical oversight that proved that even a genius is bound by the laws of gravity. When the police arrived, Nathan didn't flee. He welcomed them with a chilling, detached hospitality. He believed he could outtalk any detective. He claimed he had been out birdwatching. A genius alibi. He even had Richard Loeb back up his story. But the police brought in a counter-argument, the family chauffeur. The chauffeur testified that Nathan's car, the one he claimed to be driving, had never left the garage that day. The Superman had been caught in a binary trap. His arrogance had made him sloppy. While Nathan was struggling, 2 young reporters were hunting down the talking typewriter. They found a mechanical match in Nathan's law school essays. The typewriter used to demand ransom was the same machine Nathan had used for his homework. The perfect crime was being dismantled in the headlines. By May 31st, the weight of the evidence became insupportable. The Superman facade finally cracked. Richard Loeb was the first to break. The Golden Boy found that a murder charge was not a pulp novel adventure. He confessed, but he claimed it was Nathan who struck the fatal blow. When Nathan heard this, he confessed too, but claimed it was Loeb. They became a vicious loop of mutual accusation. But the most haunting part was the reenactment. The police took them back to the scene. In the newsreel footage, they are smiling, joking, pointing out locations with pride. They were happy to be the center of the world's gaze, even if that gaze was one of absolute horror. The stage was set for the trial of the century. The families hired Clarence Darrow, the attorney for the damned. Darrow wasn't interested in the money. He was interested in saving them from the death penalty. His strategy was a masterpiece. He had them plead guilty, removing the case from the jury and placing their fate in the hands of a single judge. Darrow argued that Leopold and Loeb were the tragic products of their own privilege and wealthy neglect. He argued that they were intellectually mature but emotionally stunted children, broken by a toxic interpretation of Nietzsche. For 2 days, Darrow delivered a closing argument that held the nation breathless. He argued that to hang these boys would be to bring the state down to the level of the murderer. "I am pleading for the future," he said. He argued that the true measure of a society is how it treats those it has every reason to hate. On September 10, 1924, Judge Caverly delivered his verdict. He acknowledged the horror of the crime, but he refused to sentence them to death. He handed down a sentence of life imprisonment plus 99 years. It was a sentence of life in a cage. For the self-proclaimed supermen, this was a different kind of death. They would spend the rest of their lives being exactly what they feared most: insignificant. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb had sought to be gods. Instead, they became the ultimate specimens in a laboratory of their own making. Richard Loeb lived in prison as a kingpin for 12 years, but on January 28, 1936, the mask of the Superman was shattered in a prison shower room. Loeb was slashed 56 times by a fellow inmate with a straight razor. The man who craved the ultimate thrill died in a desperate, slippery struggle on a wet floor, begging for his life. A Superman does not die like this. With his partner gone, Nathan Leopold was left in the ultimate void. He spent 33 years behind bars. In 1958, he was granted a pardon. He moved to Puerto Rico, married, and worked in a hospital laboratory. He returned to his study of birds. He became a man who wanted to be forgotten. Yet, the shadow of 1924 was never truly absent. He lived a life of profound psychological loneliness until his death in 1971. The saga of Leopold and Loeb is a chilling testament to the fragile nature of the human spirit. It serves as a permanent warning that intellect, when severed from morality, becomes a weapon of self-annihilation. These two supermen were dismantled by a singular mundane oversight. That pair of tortoiseshell glasses remains the ultimate symbol of arrogance unraveled. It forces a final, haunting question. In our modern chase for brilliance, have we remembered to keep our humanity? Thank you for joining us for this investigation. Do you believe Nathan Leopold ever truly found redemption, or was the ghost of Bobby Franks always standing at his garden gate? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time.